Building Better Worlds is the second game expansion for Free League's officially licensed Alien RPG. It covers aspects of the Alien universe that some might consider pretty obscure, namely two things: cruising around the galaxy in a spaceship and solving problems on planets Star Trek style, and settling down on those planets and actually working to make a colony thrive. This may seem like a bit of a stretch for the Alien universe, and to some degree a stretch for the Alien RPG rule set, which is so focused on acute stress from encounters with deadly aliens at least once per session. But surprisingly, I think the creators pulled it off. I'll cut to the chase here and tell you my major takeaway from this book. It's the best Alien RPG product yet besides the core rulebook itself. At the time of this recording, we have the core book, the starter set, which is bundled with the Chariot of the Gods scenario, the Destroyer of Worlds scenario, and the Heart of Darkness scenario. Then you have the first actual rules expansion, Colonial Marines, which gives you all the guns and vehicles and ship options for a more gun-heavy take on the game. I've done review videos for all of these books, and I'll leave a link down below to all of those. I don't really want to go over what I think about them here. Rather, I'll just tell you why Building Better Worlds is the crowning achievement of this product line thus far. It expands the game so far and wide that you have absolutely no idea what is going to hit your character, and when, if at all. Which is to say, the way this game has been presented from the first scenario all the way up through Colonial Marines is that you are in a sci-fi horror game, and anytime you come upon a derelict ship or a moon colony or space station, there is an almost 100% chance that you're going to encounter hostile aliens, which is fine. But it's a factor that can reduce the replayability and continuous enjoyment of the game. With Building Better Worlds, you're either exploring random planets or settling down on one, and it could be months of in-game time before an alien appears, if at all. There are many more sources of stress and conflict now with this expansion than there were before, and that just makes the game experience less predictable and inherently more interesting and replayable. All that being said, and that was probably the longest intro I've ever done, but I really wanted to get that out there before jumping in. Let's jump into this book, and let me show you all the details that led me to my conclusions. The first interesting thing is that it mentions that this is the second in a series of modules dedicated to campaign play, with Colonial Marines being the first. It says each campaign module will focus on one major career in the Alien universe. I can't really think of where they can go from here besides corporate career tracks, but we'll see. Here's an interesting note about the quality of the colonists. They are typically required to be graduates of higher education, which is to say that your PC is not likely to be a space trucker type. Colonists are all supposed to be carefully selected and highly trained. It's a harsh life choice though. One of the biggest themes of the Alien franchise is how harsh corporations and governments are to the humans who serve them, and being a colonist is no exception. Despite being highly educated and clear of any negative psychological issues, colonists are generally still obligated to work their daily shifts under threat of deportation and financial ruin. The carrot that gets dangled in front of them is usually shares in the profit of the colony, but they still have to pay for any initial special training. One other important bit is down here. In the current state of the law, everyone has the right to sign away all of their rights to a corporation, actually even revoking their citizenship and making themselves indentured servants. These are all softer setting details, by the way. They don't have any mechanics attached to them, but it is important for all players to know that this is the kind of world they're entering. Okay, the history recap section. To be honest, I think the historical events here are presented in a pretty confusing way. Instead of giving you every event in chronological order, they are chronological but by category. So if you read all this stuff top to bottom like I did, you end up jumping back and forth on the timeline and trying to fit everything together like a jigsaw puzzle. There's no easy way to sum up all this lore, so the best thing I can do is give you the final conclusion and current situation for humanity. Essentially, humans made several key technological breakthroughs in and around the 2030s that allowed them to travel to other planets. They discovered faster than light travel, cryosleep, and atmospheric scrubbers. So they started colonizing other planets around the galaxy, and they discovered that humans, or what we have always thought of as humans, have been seeded on different planets by the engineers, our progenitors who we call Homo genitor. That particular discovery is not widely known, but what is known is that all these nation states that have been setting up colonies around the galaxy hate each other, and war breaks out in space on at least 2 major occasions, then there is a supernova that cuts off about 70 colonies from the rest of humanity for a number of decades. That's where we are now. Colonization is as hot as it's ever been, but there are rumors of a nasty alien species out there, and an almost extinct progenitor species, which is thought to be not only responsible for seeding planet Earth with a mutated version of themselves, but also for creating that nasty alien species. Here's a much more linear recap. Due to having reviewed all of the previous Alien RPG books up until now, I feel like I've closely read this timeline or some version of it at least 3 times, and it's still only barely sinking in. In a perfect world, everyone at your table would know the basics of this history, and fortunately, this book actually approaches the timeline in different, more effective ways later in the book. One important acronym that will come up repeatedly is SEV, or Scientific Exploration Vehicles. These are the workhorses of humanity's expansion across the galaxy and can come in many different shapes and sizes. Typically, they aren't like seed ships or anything like that. They're crewed by around 12 people, including an officer, company rep, 2 pilots, 4 scientists, a synth, 2 security officers, and a scout. There's this one throwaway bit down here about first families where it's said that in some cases, a company will send about a dozen colonists to a new colony to get it set up before sending the rest of the settlers. These people sometimes have young kids with them who tag along. It's patently absurd if you think about it, but really an awesome setup for a campaign where the party is a part of a very small contingent of initial settlers in a terra incognita. Most colonies will start with 30 to 50 families, and you can run it that way too if you want. The book does a good job of discussing the hierarchy of leadership and decision making in a colony. I think it's important because the more importance you place in all of these titles and leadership positions and jobs, the more shocking and impactful it will be when one of them gets killed out of nowhere by a xenomorph. Okay, this is the first place where the lore kicks in a way that you almost kind of have to pay attention. The first semi-important faction to keep in mind is the United Nations Interstellar Settlement Corp. Think of them as the UN, a sort of powerless faction that wants to promote settler and human rights and peace in the galaxy. They don't normally play much of a role in the comings and goings of things, but they are the ones behind a major expedition that is the basis of the 7-part campaign found later in this book. The United Americas is a big one, on the other hand. This is one of the 3 major nation states left on Earth, and it is the entity under which you'll find the Colonial Marines, among other space military branches. The important thing to note about the UA is that it outsources space exploration and colonization to the private sector, aka evil corporations. The Union of Progressive Peoples, or UPP, is not really given much detail here, other than they are desperate to expand to new colonies because of overcrowding, resorting to military force when necessary. The Three World Empire, or 3WE, is the 3rd major nation state, and they are described in much the same terms as the UPP: expanding, desperate, and hostile. There are a bunch of smaller entities as well, but they're more likely to only come up in passing. Investment groups, tax shelters, science institutes, really the stuff of political intrigue. The book presents a handful of mega corporations as well. You have Weyland-Yutani, the company which you see in all the movies in one form or another. Notice the corporate slogan for the company. If you haven't caught any of the movies, this is meant to be a bit of irony, since Weyland-Yutani is actually a ruthless company with psychopathic agendas antithetical to building or improving anything that doesn't involve exploitation, deception, murder, and suffering. This is why the title of this book should give you a chuckle, and also give you a warning about what you're going to put your characters through. Anyway, Weyland-Yutani is the premier gold standard megacorp in this setting. They have all the best patents, and they can affect the decision making of those 3 nation states we talked about. Above all else, they want to uncover the mystery of the engineers and everything they created, and either patent it and sell it or use it on their enemies. Seegson is like a dollar store Weyland-Yutani, who have a few good patents here and there, but are generally used in this setting to illustrate the danger and deadliness of corporate cost cutting. If you ever played the game Alien Isolation or read the novelization of it, a story which is pretty well integrated into the canon at this point, you'll of course recall the space station Sevastopol and all those working Joes. Yeah, that was all Seegson. The first thing the game wants you to consider when making a character is their connection with other PCs. This isn't a requirement, but I think it's a good practice in most games, especially Year Zero Engine games, which are relatively pretty rules light otherwise. The point of the rules light approach with these games is to give you the elbow room to tell stories that involve these human connections. As far as the character archetypes, or careers as they're called in Alien, there are 9. 2 of which are actually new to the game, the Wildcatter and the Entertainer. Those 2 new ones come with 3 new talents each, and they're all just modifications on certain skill rolls. There are also 8 new and pretty potent general talents included in this book. They're all pretty balanced, nothing game-breaking here. Just in case you were wondering, the Wildcatter is supposed to be a sort of prospector or surveyor who goes out and finds resources either on behalf of a colony or corporation, or maybe as an independent. Like with all character archetypes in these Free League games, there's not really much to distinguish them here from each other besides their starting talents and maybe some of their starting gear. In the case of the Wildcatter, the starting gear options were a bit surprising. You can start with a decent survival suit or a whole tractor, which are a lot bigger ticket items than the average. The take on the Entertainer character is that you are better able to trick and manipulate people. But see, this is what I mean with the gear. Your normal starting gear is usually stuff you can fit into your pockets, not a whole suit or tractor. I wouldn't say there's much to report with the new guns. There are a handful of new pistols and rifles, and some heavy weapons and light clothing. Here's where the gear section gets pretty interesting. The new options for pressure suits and survival suits. If you look at this list, you'll notice there are suits that range from $600, a basic biohazard suit, all the way up to a $20,000 pressurized survival suit, as well as a portable shelter system that is nicely described here on the opposite page. I think all this gear in particular is important to the setting expansion because players will find themselves in hostile climates and environments, at least if you're doing it right. One thing that can get a little fiddly is the miscellaneous equipment that you can pick up. Each of these little bits of gear are cool, but once you start tracking little things like this, you really have to start tracking all of your little bits of gear. Okay, so there are a decent number of new vehicles in this book, and I have some mixed feelings about them. On the one hand, it's nice to have some more vehicle options. There are already a lot from previous books, but here we get some rugged civilian vehicles. On the other hand, it would have been really nice to get an illustration for all of the new vehicles. This is a problem that occurs in most RPGs, and it comes down to art budgeting more than anything, I think. Since this setting it has some very distinct vehicle designs, and the fact that these Alien RPG rulebooks are breaking new ground or otherwise pulling from obscure canon sources, it's hard to just Google search for images of some of these vehicles that haven't been illustrated. So as a GM who wants to provide basic visuals for everything, you're in a bind on some of these. Anyway, as far as the spacecraft, there is one new development that this book provides. By the way, this is an example of an SEV right here. Pretty big ship that you might find your characters in if you opt for an exploratory adventure rather than a planet-side one. But yeah, the new development here are the 3 new size classes, J, U, and X. These vary pretty wildly in length and crew. Also notice the FTL rating on these. An X-class ship is a mothership, basically, and it can take a city's worth of people pretty far. It's $4 billion if you want to buy one in cash, though. So, to understand how to run a campaign centered around a colony, the book presents a lot of really useful information about the type of colony you can have. There are generally 3 classifications. Nucleated, which is near well-established trade routes, linear, which sit on the edge of established space, and scattered colonies, which are few and far between, strewn out in the far reaches. As far as settlement types, the book presents 10, and this is where your mind really starts racing with ideas for a colony-based adventure or campaign. And of course, a colony doesn't have to be just one of these things. It can get a lot more interesting if you combine 2 or maybe even 3 of these colony mission types, and then consider the political fallout from the conflicting leadership. There's this cool suggestion up here that you can run a colony West Marches style, where there is a revolving cast of players coming and going, but unfortunately the book offers 0 guidance or tips on how to do this. As far as things your colonists will actually do from day to day, there are these adventure paradigms called expeditions. Cargo runs, salvo operations, mirror exploration, and a ton more, 14 in total, each with a brief description. Expeditions is probably not the right word to describe all of these adventure types because some of them aren't chosen by the PCs, they just happen to the PCs and the colony. like civil unrest and family squabbles and raiders and the environment. But regardless of the nomenclature, there are a lot of fascinating options for colony roleplay. The game introduces a very sandworm-like beast called a harvester. And I think this is good. The book is really trying to spread the canon's wings a bit and just be a little more like a gritty, muted Star Wars in terms of biodiversity. Nothing close to Star Wars, of course, but they're trying to create a universe here that isn't just hyper-deadly xenomorph variants and engineers. If you wanted to opt for the more Star Trek-y adventuring from planet to planet in a spaceship, the book provides a good spread of former and existing colonies across the galaxy to inspire you. This is the whole list of them here, and there are resources in the back of the book that can help you generate more for yourself. As nice as the presentation is on each of these, you can see that they are a bit sparse on detail in terms of what a GM can work with. For example, these little map snippets look kind of neat at a glance, but I couldn't tell you where they are in the galaxy without a fair bit of investigation. But the point of all this stuff is just to get your imagination flowing more than anything, and they opted for more quantity rather than fewer colonies with tons of detail. I do appreciate a lot of the artwork and art direction in this book. Once you start planet hopping, the aesthetic has to depart from dark interiors with xenomorphs jumping out from around the corner, and I'm glad they embraced that fact. Here's my favorite thing about this whole chapter. Right here it says that humanity cut off a whole bunch of colonies about 70 years ago, establishing a 20 parsec or 65 light year radius from Earth within which they would operate. This meant that dozens of colonies, large and small, have been on their own for that long, and now the veil has lifted and you can go explore those colonies, but you're not quite sure what you'll find. This is reminiscent of the setup in Forbidden Lands, where a fantasy land was shrouded in an impenetrable darkness for years, but when the fog lifted, your characters were the first to go and check it out, aka plunder it for treasure. These long abandoned colonies run the gamut in terms of their purpose, size, and population, but I imagine what you'll likely want to present as the GM are colonies which are mostly bitter towards the main bulk of humanity for seemingly abandoning them for 3 generations. At this point in the book, just short of halfway through the 304 pages, I have to warn you of massive spoilers. There's a 7-part campaign that takes up most of the rest of this book, and I won't be covering the specifics of that, but I will be discussing the main revelations of that campaign because they're too important to the Alien canon for me to hide. So consider this to be the start of the spoiler zone. In this creatures section of the book, I have to say I was pretty disappointed to see repeats of creatures from other books. They copy-pasted things like these xenocobras. I mean, I get it. They want to provide some monsters for people who may not have gotten the previous Alien books, so they copied some from those previous books. But as a huge fan of this product line, I don't really enjoy this kind of redundancy. It almost feels like a bad practice or a faux pas of some sort to do this. But all that aside, check out this major development in the canon. This was heavily alluded to in the Heart of Darkness adventure, but here we get a very clear, concise statement of what's going on. In a nutshell, the engineers created the black goo in order to create new kinds of life. There are different kinds of black goo. Some of it mixes with engineered DNA to make humans. Other kinds mix with the DNA of all kinds of animals to make xenomorphs. But one kind of goo made a very powerful new species called full Fremen, or perfected. Long story short, the engineers tried to wipe out the perfected, but the perfected almost completely wiped out the engineers and drove the last of them into deep space. Now the perfected are lurking in our galaxy and looking to hijack ships in order to get to Earth and convert all of humanity into them. Ironically, as important as the perfected are in this latest update to the canon and to the 7-part campaign in this book, you actually don't get an illustration of them. Actually, you don't even get a physical description of them. They are illustrated in the Heart of Darkness book, at least, and if you'll recall, the visual cue they take is that of H.R. Giger, the original artist behind the xenomorph design from the original movie. Almost all of the rest of this bestiary is copy-pasted from previous books, but this one is new, to the game at least, and it's really great. The Empress, a stage 8 xenomorph, is twice as large as a queen and requires multiple hives to be established before one can be produced. You basically need an apocalypse of xenomorphs on a planet before an Empress is birthed. And that is actually one of the main goals of the Perfected. Another more minor new monster is the bioluminescent xeno, which has glow-in-the-dark radioactive skin. Actually, the most interesting thing here is this statement. Biomorphs are a rare type of xenomorph XX121, that's your standard jazz hands xenomorph from the original movies, that have been affected by exotic matter. This means you don't just have glow-in-the-dark xenos, you can come up with xenos of all kinds, which have been fundamentally mutated by different environmental conditions and materials. The sky is the limit here. Okay, so most of the rest of this book is the beautifully executed sandbox-style campaign where there's a whole overarching plot involving a major expedition to reconnect with all those abandoned colonies and finding the perfected and their dastardly plans for Earth and all that. And as much as I've spoiled the big surprise here in this video, there is so much adventure packed into each of these 7 scenarios that I think you can still be surprised. Also, you don't really have to follow all the details in this book to a T. You can change some things here and there and still surprise your players, even if they've had the misfortune of watching this video. I'm pretty sure you have permission to do that by the authors. I'll just mention that the approach to presenting each of these 7 scenarios feels like it's better than it's ever been in this game's run so far. There is more emphasis on player choice and autonomy within the confines of still trying to present an overall story. And the number of quality encounter maps is just as high as it's ever been. I don't want to reveal too many pages here, but I'll just say about half of this book is filled with lovingly detailed exoplanetary adventure. There is one last section that provides you with the tools needed for colony play. You first get a good number of tables for generating unique planets, as well as unique colonies that have their own stats. Those stats are the basis for colony-based play. Each colony has these 6 stats. Even as you're doing little expeditions here and there over the course of sessions, you will occasionally zoom out, specifically once every 6 months of in-game time, and do some management of your colony. The idea is that you want to improve the colony, and you do that by adopting policies, installations, and projects. There are 72 of those provided in the book, and each one of them will tweak your colony's core stats in one way or another. As far as who is in charge of the colony, it doesn't necessarily have to be the PCs themselves, but if it isn't, then NPCs should occupy a number of key leadership positions, just in case they come into play in the story. The whole colony play cycle works in phases. Phase 1 is a random colony incident from this table. There's a fair chance that nothing horrible happens to the colony and that you in fact get a little bump in a stat, but you could also lose stat points here pretty randomly. Phase 2 is a skill roll to see if each member of the command team did their job properly. This roll also affects the colony's stats. Phase 3 involves expanding the colony if it has reached a development level threshold. The final phase is starting a new colony initiative, installation, or project. Fortunately, the creators of this supplement came up with a nice sheet for tracking all the details and history of a colony. The colony is really a shared player character, one that will likely outlive any one given player-controlled character. Alright, here are my thoughts on Alien RPG Building Better Worlds. Copy-paste bestiary. Like I mentioned, the repeated monster stats and artwork don't really sit well with me. No illustrations for some vehicles. I know it's a lot to ask for an illustration of every new vehicle, but not having those images just puts a lot of burden on GMs and players. For people who play theater of the mind, it's no big deal, but I think of RPGs as an increasingly visual hobby in terms of how a lot of people interface with it, not a colony simulator. No matter how you slice it, the supplement does not magically turn the Alien RPG into any kind of realistic simulator of colony administration, or for starship management for that matter. I didn't really think of it before, but you never really have to worry about starship fuel or supplies in this game. And that's just the nature of the game. It's rules light. Your character has talents and whatnot, but ultimately they just have 12 skills. You're rolling on 12 skills over and over for everything. Simple, effective colony management. I think of the rules light nature of the Year Zero engine actually as its greatest strength. And every time they make a subsystem for it, such as the colony cycle and management system in this game, I love that it just comes down to a few roles. It's just a certain style of play where the rules aren't meant to dictate the story as much as gently guide it. Great new monsters. I love the giant harvester worm just because it's an interesting departure from all the creepy crawly personal attack monsters that this setting is known for. And the Empress Xeno, and which really should have gotten an illustration in this book, by the way, is a great tool for an epic campaign finale, or maybe even as a MacGuffin. Satisfying canon. I felt like a lot of the mystery and the questions posed in the core rulebook and the previous adventure books about the engineers and the black goo have finally and definitively been answered in this book. It's just nice to have an official explanation for everything. Great presentation. I have to tip my hat to the team for the layout, the encounter maps, and the occasionally breathtaking cosmic vistas incorporated into this book, as well as the useful and tastefully done colony and star system tracker sheets. I do have one thing on my wish list for this game though. I would have loved to see more resources and guidance on advanced colony management in-game. What happens if you grow your colony to be wildly successful? What would it look like to become a regional player in the constant strife between all the corporations and nation states? I wouldn't necessarily need a chapter on this, but a few rollable tables and big picture options for players would have been quite intriguing and possibly pretty useful. It's interesting, whereas the first expansion for this game, Colonial Marines, gives you all the backstory and options for heavy-duty armed combat, inspired mostly by James Cameron's Aliens movie, this expansion doesn't really have any major media touchstones. Sure, there were always colonists in the movies, and that is a major aspect of humanity's existence in the time period in which most alien stories take place, but we've never really gotten a movie that is about any of these exoplanetary colonists. So this book is a sort of gift in that sense, in that it gives you the background and the gameplay tools and guidance to create the one-shot or campaign that tells a story in the alien universe about those colonists. You might have to nudge yourself out of your comfort zone and your personal definition of what makes Alien officially Alien, but if you have an open mind, this is an awesome expansion. Let me know your thoughts on this one. I've left links down below for everything. Thanks as always for watching. See ya.